Hey everybody, today we are doing another topic video. This week I asked you guys name a movie that you could only watch once because it was too painful or too difficult to watch a second time. So here we go. Irreversible. I find myself drawn to and wanting to revisit Climax and Into the Void, but the idea of rewatching Irreversible makes me a bit queasy. It's just so visceral and brutal with its depiction of assault and rape that I can't see myself returning to it because the experience is that difficult to sit through. So, unsurprisingly, this one probably popped up more than any other in terms of the answers that I received. Irreversible was a huge one on there. And I understand why. I mean, even before I had seen the movie, that's all people would talk about, how difficult it was to watch because of course, the infamous real-time rape scene that you see in it. And I think for other reasons, true. It's a very brutal, very, very, very dark movie. And of course, it's Gaspar Noé, so of course, you know, he's known for offending people. I know people that think that Irreversible is absolutely disgusting. Some people will not watch it because they've heard so many negative things about it, or I should say controversial things about it. The first time I saw the movie, I watched it all the way through and then watched it again twice in a row, and it didn't bother me. And part of me wonders if that's just because I see a lot more movies than the average person. I kind of disassociate and I have to kind of sit there and break it apart, be more critical of it. But yeah, for me, I actually think that scene is extremely important. I know a lot of people say that it's, really negative towards women or anti-feminist or whatever, and I totally disagree. I actually think that this movie is very pro-women, and actually that was my criticism of it, surprisingly. To me, I felt like it depicted women as these kind of very beautiful and nurturing creatures, and then it kind of showed men as more one-dimensional. But that particular scene, I think, is so important because it is Gaspar Noé. He likes to push you into very uncomfortable territory. He also likes to push the extremes of emotion and see how far he can take you. And it's often going to be uncomfortable. It's often going to be kind of a wild ride, and that's part of his point. For better or worse, I always say, there is a toxicity to that, but there's also something I feel like you can learn from and evolve from. I think there's something to gain from that because, that sort of stuff is quite complex, and I feel that way about this movie. The movie is called Irreversible. The film is told backwards to forwards, and it's all about how, about the context of certain things. So when we're introduced to the character, the Monica Bellucci character who gets raped, that's really our first introduction to her. It's kind of shock value. For a purpose, though, because then as the movie goes on, we learn more about her character and what led up to that point. And it really does change your perspective on that thing. And we realize just how much our emotions guide us, and often into very toxic and dark areas. For me, the most effective part of that scene is, it's going on for quite a long time. A stranger comes by in the background, and you can't really see him, but he sees what's going on, and he knows that if he were to try to stop it, something really bad would happen to him likely. It's a big risk, so he walks away. And that, to me, is an extremely powerful part of the point, because it's like, yeah, he has no connection to these people. But what if he did? What if that was his wife? It completely changes the way that you react to things. And that's the whole point of Irreversible. And yes, Gaspar Noé, the way he goes about conveying these things is through shock value. But I think, again, there's something to that shock value where he's making you very aware of it. I think Irreversible is an extraordinary film. I think it might be my favorite Gaspar Noé film. Admittedly, for me, I'm not a squeamish person. I don't get easily offended. It takes a lot for me to not be able to watch something. And I really don't have a very interesting answer to this question. For me, the one movie that I could only watch once, it's not particularly shocking or violent or anything like that. It's a silent film. It's Passion of Joan of Arc. And it was more just about how Carl Dreyer was able to convey through emotion and just through simplicity and images. There's just a stark, contrasty power and a timelessness to that film that is extremely effective to me. It just evokes certain emotions in me, and not because anything is really seen. Everything is implied, and there's a power to that. Now, I would watch it again now, but I haven't seen it in 10 years, and I only watched it once because it was very uncomfortable for me. Next one, Requiem for a Dream. It is an extremely intense film and shows you the potential consequences of substance abuse. It's extremely disturbing, especially if you have used substances that are a little harder than marijuana, because it makes you reflect on your own decisions and how it could negatively impact your own life. You don't need Dare to keep kids off drugs. Just show them this movie instead. It's far more effective. I get it. I understand. This is another very popular answer to this question I see a lot, especially on this particular response. But I disagree. I actually I might have agreed when I was 16 years old. I saw this movie the first time, I think I was 16 or 17. I didn't know anything about addiction or drugs or violence or, all this more adult stuff. And so when I watched it, it disturbed me so much and I was so kind of horrified by it. I didn't think I could ever watch it again. But then, I watched it when I was like 25 and I had been through a lot of life myself. I've been through some pretty extreme, drug experiences and addictions, and I've been somewhat vocal about that on here. So with that perspective, I watched this movie and it didn't bother me. It just felt like I was reliving a lot of experiences I've had, just in a more cinematic sense. So it was just like, it was kind of more fascinating than anything else. Partially why I don't connect to that film, I think, is because unlike Gaspar Noé, I always feel like Darren Aronofsky, in particular with this film, he's using all of these flourishes and techniques and, trying to be very interesting in terms of the editing without really having much to say beyond that. With Gaspar Noé and Irreversible, he's, giving you these experiences almost like this 2001 A Space Odyssey sort of meditative thing where you're falling into the experience and you can kind of create your own ideas of what you feel. And it's just much more open to interpretation and, to me, much more complex in terms of the way he's serving it to you. Whereas Darren Aronofsky, it feels very one-dimensional. When you get down to it, all the viscera of this movie, you break it all down, there's really nothing interesting it has to say, just drugs are bad. And, we all fall victim to this instant gratification culture and, pop culture in particular. And yeah, that's just not particularly interesting. So you're gonna, for me at least, to me it feels utterly meaningless, but beautifully done. Don't get me wrong, it is beautifully done and I respect the way it was edited and designed and the way it looks, but it doesn't mean anything for me. It feels hollow. Antichrist, I didn't like it. A lot of explicit imagery felt exploitive rather than meaningful in any way. I love Antichrist. I recognize that it is quite difficult. One of the more difficult films. Some people get nauseous when they watch it, especially at the end. Understandably, it's, a very, very brutal film. But I think that, again, with it, it's really making an interesting point. Yeah, it's a little all over the place at times. Yeah, there are times where I kind of am confused about what he's trying to say specifically, and it does ultimately come out as uneven. But there are aspects of the film that I think are absolutely incredible. Exploring relationships, exploring women and men and how they view each other in such a unique way that is quite, biblical, exploring the nature of depression and toxicity. And I don't know, I think that there is a lot there to explore. And sometimes when you're exploring really dark and twisted things that, are kind of taboo, you gotta push there and explore certain things that you wouldn't normally want to look at, and that's okay. And that's kind of how I feel about that film. But, it's a very controversial one, and again, that's another one where people are infuriated by it or they find something meaningful out of it. I personally found something meaningful. A Cloak of Orange. I really appreciate the artistry, but the subject matter is so difficult to watch, it's just not something I want to or feel the need to return to. That's an answer I have heard ever since I started talking about A Cloak of Orange. The first time I saw the movie, people would respond to it and go, oh God, that movie, I can't watch it. Someone I know said, oh, I only saw the first 10 minutes and I turned it off. It was too much for me. And I thought, that's kind of sad. I feel bad for people like that because, naturally the first 10, 15 minutes is Kubrick really being intense and really throwing things in your face. And that's very intentional. And of course, he's doing it with his classic sort of cold, kind of sterile, distant camera. So that makes it even more unsettling to watch. But there is a calm after the storm. So all of that's happening, it's kind of frenzied, and then it zeroes in on the antihero and really kind of living with him for a little bit. And that's where the sympathy and the emotional resonance starts to come in. I actually think that A Cloak of Orange, that's another one that, it doesn't particularly affect me in that way because I'm not emotionally connected to it. That's a movie I more appreciate rather than one that I'm really passionate about and I love. But I agree with you. You say you appreciate the artistry. Oh, I do too. I think it demands a viewing just because of how extraordinary it is in that sense. That it is a movie exploring pop culture and violence and shock value and art and where is the line and what is the art. And I think that's done very well in a lot of ways. Ultimately, I do feel it's not as emotionally complex as other films of his, and maybe that's why it doesn't resonate with me in terms of it's hard for me to watch. I feel like I can't look at it. But it's kind of one of those technical tour de forces. Grave of the Fireflies was really hard to get through the first time. Even though you know the ending when the movie begins, you're still hoping that something happens, and they survive the movie. Left me feeling really bitter and just depressed for a while afterwards. Yeah, I was waiting for that one. For me, why I think it's so difficult to return to is actually maybe a different thing. Like, let's leave aside that aspect of it. Let's leave aside the fact that these are starving children. You know, it's a movie that feels very real because it's very multifaceted. You know, it's a movie that, yes, the story itself is so extremely devastating, and yet there's a beauty to it. You know, there's a beautiful look to the style of animation, especially, you know, the backgrounds and everything. They have kind of a pastel beauty to them. It's a movie that appreciates the smallest little moments and allows for peaceful, quiet moments. And the two main characters, the brother and sister, they feel like a brother and sister. It's not overly sentimental. Sometimes they hate each other. Sometimes they love each other. Sometimes they're bored. You know, it feels very real. But I love how it shows that immaturity. You know, like a young boy, this brother is too young to be trying to provide food and survive and, you know, make sure his sister survives. And he makes some kind of dumb and stubborn decisions. But again, they feel very much like something that a normal child would do. And of course, the result is devastating. But that's why it's so powerful, because it is so real. There was a movie that came out maybe 10, 12 years ago called The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. And I still remember that movie because that is also a movie, of course, about a devastating subject, the Holocaust. And, you know, there are two children at the center of the movie. And the ending to it, I hated. I felt, and if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. I hated that ending because it felt like it was using sentiment as a gimmick in order to express the darkness and the devastation, rather than it really feeling authentic and like it was building towards something. It felt exploitive, and that, to me, is offensive. Whereas Grave of the Fireflies is nuanced and painful and beautiful. I know the idea behind it might scare you away, but if you're a true film fan, it's, for me, essential viewing. You know, I think it's important to watch things that are difficult. It's important to see things that are difficult, to take yourself out of your own headspace and your own life and your own experiences. And that is, of course, one of the beautiful things about film and art. But yeah, no, those are the questions, or those are the answers, I should say, and that was really, really interesting reading a lot of them. But that is the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you look over here, you will see my Patreon supporters. The link to support is below. Also, all of my social media is below that. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.